Afternoon. A gunman walks toward the most protected building on Earth. Secret Service agents spot him. He runs. He fires. They fire back. A child caught in the crossfire. And just 8 days before this, another armed man tried to breach the same security. Same city, same target, same week. This was not a coincidence. This was a pattern. And what that pattern means for your money, your business, your future, is something the headlines will never tell you. Welcome to Currency Watch, the one place where the news is not just news. It is a warning, written in numbers. Now, before we go any further, if you are someone who has lived long enough to know that nothing in this world happens by accident, do us a small favor, dear friend. The way you would remind a loved one to lock the door before sleeping, just press that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and it may save you from missing the one analysis that changes how you see the world. And tell us in the comments below, where in the world are you watching us from today? Karachi, London, Toronto, New York? We want to know who is paying attention, because the people paying attention right now are the ones who will be ahead when everyone else is still catching up. It was an ordinary Monday afternoon in Washington, D.C., the kind of afternoon where government officials move through schedules, journalists prepare their evening reports, and tourists walk the National Mall with cameras in hand. May 4th, 2026, 3:30 p.m. And then, everything stopped. Plainclothes Secret Service agents were conducting routine outer perimeter surveillance near the White House complex. Standard procedure, invisible to the public eye, but these agents are trained to notice what ordinary people never see. And on this afternoon, they noticed something. A man moving through the crowd near the Washington Monument, his body language slightly off, his clothing concealing something, the faint but unmistakable outline of a weapon pressed against his frame. The agents did not panic. They observed. They communicated quietly through their earpieces. They alerted uniformed Secret Service officers nearby. Every movement calculated, every second measured. This is what elite security training looks like in practice. But what happened next was not part of any routine. Uniformed officers moved in to make contact with the suspect. A standard approach, professional, controlled. But the moment they closed the distance, the man ran. Not the nervous stumble of someone caught off guard. A deliberate sprint. The kind that tells trained professionals everything they need to know. He was armed. He knew it. And now he knew they knew it. Within seconds, the suspect drew his firearm, and he fired directly at the approaching Secret Service officers. In the shadow of the Washington Monument, in broad daylight, shots were fired at agents of the United States government. The officers returned fire immediately. The suspect was struck, transported under emergency conditions to George Washington Hospital. His condition, undisclosed. But the story did not end there. In the chaos of the crossfire, a child was hit. A minor, an innocent bystander, caught between a desperate man and the officers sworn to protect the nation. Investigators later concluded the child was struck by the suspect's own gunfire, transported to hospital. Condition described as not life-threatening. But let that image settle for a moment. A child, wounded, blocks from the White House, inside the White House complex. The response was immediate and total. Journalists covering a scheduled presidential event were rushed off the North Lawn, escorted at speed into the briefing room. No explanation given, just movement, just urgency, the kind that requires no words. Access points across the complex were sealed. Police vehicles converged, emergency teams deployed. The entire security architecture of the most protected address in the world shifted into its highest state of readiness within minutes. And yet, President Donald Trump's scheduled event with small business owners continued. He did not publicly address the shooting. That silence is worth noting. What the public saw was a lockdown. What analysts saw was something far more significant. Just moments before the shooting, the vice president's motorcade had transited through that exact area. Secret Service Deputy Director Matthew Quinn confirmed this publicly. He was careful with his words, precise. He stated there was no confirmed indication the suspect was targeting the motorcade. But he also said something equally important. Whether or not it was directed to the president or not, I don't know. But we will find out. When the second highest security official in the United States stands before cameras and says he does not know if the nation's executive leadership was the intended target, that is not a reassurance. That is a confession of uncertainty at the highest level. The suspect was later identified as Michael Marks, 45 years old, from Texas, a name that meant nothing to the world 24 hours earlier. A man now at the center of a federal investigation that reaches far beyond one afternoon on the National Mall. His weapon was recovered at the scene. His motive remains officially undisclosed, and that silence around his motive is perhaps the most important detail of this entire incident. Because in the world of political risk analysis, it is never the bullet that moves markets. It is the question behind the bullet. And right now, that question has no public answer. Forget the gunshot for a moment. Forget the lockdown, the police tape, the breaking news alerts. Because if you only see this as a shooting incident near the White House, you're already missing the real story. Open any history book on political risk analysis. Turn to any chapter on institutional collapse, on empire decline, on the slow erosion of state authority. You will find one consistent warning sign buried inside every case study. Not a single catastrophic event, but a pattern. Small fractures, appearing close together, in the same place, within the same window of time. Washington, D.C. just gave the world that pattern, and most people were too busy watching the headlines to read it. Go back exactly 8 days before Michael Marks fired at Secret Service agents near the Washington Monument, April 26, 2026. The White House Correspondents' Dinner, one of the most high-profile social events on Washington's annual calendar. A gathering of journalists, politicians, celebrities, and senior government officials. Security presence, extensive, cameras, everywhere. The world watching. And yet, a man named Cole Thomas Allen walked toward a Secret Service checkpoint, armed with guns and knives, and attempted to breach the perimeter. He was stopped. A Secret Service officer was shot in the confrontation. The officer survived only because he was wearing body armor. Read that again carefully. A Secret Service officer was shot at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. This was not a footnote. This was not a minor disturbance quickly forgotten. This was a direct, armed assault on the security infrastructure surrounding the President of the United States. And 8 days later, it happened again. 2 armed incidents, 8 days apart, same city, same security perimeter, same target geography. Now ask yourself the question that no mainstream headline asked. What are the odds? In 20 years of relatively stable executive security, the White House perimeter held, not perfectly, but consistently. Breaches were rare, armed confrontations, rarer still. And now, twice in 8 days. This is not a coincidence that serious analysts accept at face value. This is a data point. And data points that repeat become patterns. And patterns always mean something. Historically, clusters of security failures around executive power have never existed in isolation. They have always been symptoms of something larger moving beneath the surface. Consider 1981, when John Hinckley fired 6 shots at President Ronald Reagan outside the Washington Hilton. Markets dropped immediately. The dollar trembled. But what history remembers less clearly is what came before that moment. A period of intense domestic tension, economic anxiety, institutional distrust building quietly across American society. The shooting did not create the instability. The instability created the conditions for the shooting. Now return to 2026. The United States enters this moment carrying significant institutional weight. Political polarization at historic levels, public trust in federal institutions at generational lows, economic pressure spreading from boardrooms to kitchen tables across the country. And inside that environment, 2 armed men, in 8 days, test the security of the most protected address on Earth. One breaches a checkpoint. One fires directly at agents. Both reach further than they should have. This is the part that demands honest analysis. Not whether the Secret Service responded correctly. They did, with professionalism and speed. The deeper question is structural. Why are these attempts happening with increasing proximity and frequency? That question leads serious analysts away from security briefings and directly into the territory of political risk economics. Because here is what markets understand that news anchors rarely explain. When the physical security around executive power is tested repeatedly, foreign governments notice, institutional investors notice, sovereign wealth funds run probability models, risk departments inside the world's largest banks update their country assessments quietly. Nobody announces these adjustments publicly, but the numbers eventually speak. Capital does not wait for certainty. It moves on probability, and right now, the probability models around U.S. political stability just received 2 very significant inputs. In 8 days, the pattern has been established. The question that every serious business mind must now ask is not what happened near the Washington Monument on May 4th, but what this pattern is signaling about the deeper condition of American institutional authority in 2026, because that signal is already moving money, quietly, deliberately, and in one very specific direction. There's a language that governments never speak publicly. Central banks do not broadcast it. Finance ministers do not reference it in press conferences. And mainstream financial media rarely translates it with the precision it deserves. It is the language of political risk pricing. And right now, that language is being spoken very loudly, in the one place most people never think to look. Not in Washington, not in the Oval Office, not in any security briefing room, but in the quiet, cold, calculated movements of global capital. Here's a fundamental truth that every serious entrepreneur and business decision maker must permanently install into their thinking. Markets do not react to events. Markets react to what events reveal. When the stock market dropped 2.9% in the 13 minutes following the first reports of gunshots near the Reagan motorcade in 1981, it was not reacting to one man with a gun. It was reacting to the sudden, visceral realization that American executive continuity was fragile, that the institutional machinery holding the world's reserve currency together had a human vulnerability at its center. That is what markets priced in 13 minutes. Not the bullet, the implication of the bullet. Fast forward to May 2026. The United States arrives at this moment carrying an economic profile that demands serious examination. Federal debt sitting above $36 trillion. Interest payments on that debt consuming a larger share of the national budget than at any point in modern American history. Inflation pressures that central bank policy has suppressed but not resolved. A manufacturing base still rebuilding after years of supply chain restructuring. And a dollar whose reserve currency status faces its most sophisticated geopolitical challenge in 80 years. This is the economic foundation beneath the building that just went into lockdown. Now place 2 armed security incidents on top of that foundation, 8 days apart, and ask yourself what a sovereign wealth fund manager in Singapore sees, what a bond trader in Frankfurt calculates, what a foreign direct investment committee in Tokyo quietly decides to postpone. The immediate market movements following May 4th told part of the story, but the more significant signals were not in the headlines. They were in the bond market, where yield movements on short-term Treasury instruments reflected a brief but measurable adjustment in risk perception, where foreign holders of American debt, the governments and institutions that collectively own trillions in U.S. Treasury securities, registered the incident not as a news event, but as a variable in their ongoing assessment of American political continuity. They were in the currency markets, where the dollar index experienced the kind of subtle but deliberate repositioning that professional traders recognize immediately. Not a collapse, not a crisis, but a recalibration, the kind that happens when probability models are quietly updated. And they were in the energy markets, where any event that introduces uncertainty into the American executive decision-making apparatus immediately affects production policy expectations, strategic reserve calculations, and the geopolitical pricing of oil that underpins every business cost structure on Earth. Consider what serious political economists call the executive stability premium. It is not a number you will find published anywhere. It is not a line item on any balance sheet. But it is built into the pricing of virtually every major asset class connected to the United States economy. It is the invisible confidence tax that global markets charge, or discount, based on their assessment of how stable, continuous, and functional American executive power appears to be. When that premium erodes, even slightly, the effects move through the global financial system like a pressure wave, slow at first, difficult to attribute to any single cause, but cumulative, and ultimately measurable. 2 security incidents in 8 days do not collapse that premium overnight, but they compress it. And compression in financial systems always precedes a more significant movement. Now bring this analysis directly to the entrepreneur sitting in Karachi, the young business owner in Lagos, the aspiring investor watching from Toronto or Dubai. You may believe this is an American story. It is not. The American dollar settles approximately 88% of all international trade transactions. American Treasury bonds form the collateral backbone of the global banking system. American political stability is not a domestic luxury. It is a global economic infrastructure. When that infrastructure shows visible stress fractures, the pressure does not stay inside American borders. It travels through trade relationships, through currency corridors, through import costs and export competitiveness and the quiet tightening of international credit conditions. It arrives in your city, in your industry, in your business, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not in 30 days, but in the compounding logic of global capital flows, it is already in motion. And the only question that remains for the serious decision maker watching this analysis is whether you will position yourself before that motion becomes visible to everyone or after. Every crisis in history produced 2 kinds of people, not the rich and the poor, not the powerful and the powerless, but the prepared and the surprised. And the only difference between those 2 groups was never intelligence, never talent, never even access to information. It was the willingness to act on a signal before the signal became a headline. You have just spent the last 3 parts of this analysis receiving a signal, not speculation, not fear-mongering, not the dramatic noise of a 24-hour news cycle designed to capture your attention and sell you nothing of value. A signal, built from verified facts, historical precedent, in the cold, honest logic of how global capital has always behaved when political stability around executive power shows visible stress. Now comes the part that separates the analyst from the observer. What do you actually do with this information? The first principle of navigating political risk as a business decision maker is one that experienced investors have applied across every major geopolitical disruption of the last century. Never position against the signal, position alongside it. When institutional uncertainty rises around a major economy, certain sectors contract and certain sectors expand. This is not theory. This is the documented, repeatable behavior of capital under political stress conditions. The sectors that historically contract first are those most dependent on long-term policy continuity. Infrastructure development, large-scale real estate, long-duration capital projects requiring stable regulatory environments. These are the spaces where smart money quietly reduces exposure during periods of elevated executive uncertainty. The sectors that historically expand tell a more interesting story. Defense and private security industries see immediate capital inflows. Precious metals, particularly gold, experience sustained demand increases as institutional investors seek stores of value outside the political risk perimeter. Cybersecurity firms expand as governments increase spending on protective infrastructure. And perhaps, most importantly for entrepreneurs watching this analysis, essential commodity businesses, food supply chains, energy distribution, healthcare, the industries that human beings cannot stop consuming, regardless of who sits in any government building anywhere on Earth. These are not exciting investment narratives. They are survival capital destinations. And survival capital always moves first. The second principle applies specifically to the young entrepreneur, the aspiring business builder watching this from a developing economy, from a city where American political events feel distant and abstract. Understand this clearly. Your local currency is likely priced against the dollar. Your import costs are calculated in dollars. Your access to international credit markets runs through dollar-denominated systems. Your business, regardless of what it sells or where it operates, is downstream from American political stability. This is not dependency. This is architecture. The architecture of the global financial system as it currently exists, which means the strategic intelligence for you is not to fear dollar volatility. It is to prepare your business structure for it. Diversify your supplier relationships across multiple currency corridors, reduce your business exposure to single market dependencies, build cash reserves and assets that historically hold value during dollar uncertainty cycles, and most critically, develop revenue streams that function in local currency with local demand drivers. The businesses that survived every major dollar disruption of the last 50 years shared one characteristic. They were not immune to the pressure, but they were not entirely dependent on the conditions that created it. The third principle is the one that most people in the business community consistently undervalue. Information timing is a competitive asset. The analysis you have received today will become common knowledge within weeks. Financial media will eventually connect these dots. Mainstream commentary will eventually frame these incidents within the broader economic narrative. But by the time that framing reaches the general public, the positioning window will have already closed. This is not cynical. This is simply how information moves through markets. The distance between early signal recognition and mainstream awareness is precisely where asymmetric opportunity lives. The investor who repositioned after Reagan was shot captured the recovery. The investor who repositioned before the institutional uncertainty fully priced in captured something far more significant. Currency Watch exists for exactly this purpose. Not to alarm you, not to manufacture urgency where none exists, but to translate the events that governments describe as security incidents into the economic language that they actually represent. Because what happened near the Washington Monument on May 4th, 2026 was not simply a shooting. It was a data point in a pattern that is writing a message in the language of capital flows, of sovereign risk premiums, of the slow, deliberate repositioning of serious money away from concentrated political uncertainty. And that message has already been received by the people who are paying attention. The only question that remains is whether you were one of them.